Buenos dias. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our closing side event of the WHO Global Conference on Air Pollution and Health here in Cartagena. Many thanks to those that have found the energy and commitment to join us after 4 intensive days of talks, meetings, and activities. I am Lucas, the Global Coordinator for the Health and Urbanization Program of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And I would like to also extend a warm welcome to those joining us online as this event is being live streamed. We also have simultaneous translation in Spanish for both in-person and online participants. So, muchas gracias para las que están aquí con nosotros. Pueden escuchar toda la sesión en español con traducción en vivo. So, the program for today is going to be organized in the following manner. After this short introduction, Jen Kuhl of the Global Climate and Health Alliance, who we are delighted to co-host this event with, will present some new key findings on the health harms of fossil fuels from an upcoming report, which will highlight the imperative of a just transition to protect health. We're very excited about this upcoming report. We will also hear from Dr. Maria Neira, who somehow still has the energy, dedication, and generosity to share time with us after such an intensive week. And finally, we will hear from representatives from across a wide spectrum of civic organizations that are challenging the fossil fuel industry across a range of geographies and through a range of perspectives and tactics. So before we get into all this, please allow me to take a little step back and contextualize this event and our broader engagement within the WHO conference within our campaign for a fossil fuel treaty. Fossil fuels are one of the greatest threats of our time. They threaten everything we care for: our nature's biodiversity, our peace and security, our economies, and of course, the health of our communities. Air quality is the great leveler. We've heard this throughout the week. Responsible for 7 million deaths annually, 80% of air pollution can be directly linked to fossil fuels. Phasing out the production and use of oil, gas, and coal is thus one of the most effective and cost-efficient global health interventions available today. And so even though fossil fuels are responsible for 86% of carbon pollution over the past decade, we know that governments are on track to produce more than double what is consistent with keeping below the critical 1.5 degree mark. We believe that across multiple levels of government and across multiple sectors, we must face fossil fuels as the cross-cutting issue that they are. We have the opportunity to chart a new course, but this will require bold and courageous action. The Paris Agreement doesn't mention the words oil, gas, and coal a single time. We need to bring together governments for a binding agreement that will halt the expansion fossil fuels and commit to a just and equitable transition to cleaner and sustainable energy for all. This is why we're proposing a treaty mechanism to foster international cooperation to complement the Paris Agreement by providing a plan to transition away from fossil fuels in a way that is fast, fair, and financed. You can hear the 3 pillars of our campaign initiative. And a growing coalition is pushing for this treaty. As of today, 16 nations, over 130 cities and subnational governments, including 18 national capitals, 4,000 civil society organizations, hundreds of health organizations, including the World Health Organization, the European Parliament, faith leaders, youth organizations, 10 indigenous nations, and trade unions representing over 30 million workers support our initiative. And so I'd like to stop here for a second and show a video that showcases a little bit what our campaign is about in a succinct and vivid manner. in just a second.
Connections nourish us. It's what makes us human. They tie us to the land, to the air we breathe. But the climate crisis is threatening the very fabric of life.
Extreme weather, massive floods, temperatures soaring.
Thousands of people have been evacuated.
100,000 people have been evacuated.
And the culprit? Fossil fuels. We know they're poisoning our world. But instead of phasing out fossil fuels, many governments are ramping up. And it's time to quit.
Oil is now flowing through the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion.
Work will begin to extract crude from the Rosebank oil field.
We need an exit ramp off the highway to pipeline.
We need a new plan. We need a fossil fuel treaty. A global call to
stop the expansion of fossil fuels.
Phasing out fossil fuels to adjust to the equitable transition.
We've stopped weapons of mass destruction before.
And today, a new historic treaty has been signed.
With a stroke of a pen. And we can do it again. Wealthy nations must move first and fastest. And other nations are already leading the way.
This treaty is imperative and monumental.
We can no longer wait. No hay otro camino.
To face down coal, oil, and gas.
Communities have stepped up, championing a movement all over the world. It's the connections we hold dear and that we're striving to protect that will ultimately save us. After all, we can't help it. It's what makes us human. Protect what you love.
Thank you. That was just a reminder that we must also look beyond the four walls of the Centro de Convenciones de Cartagena de Indias that we've all been intimately familiar with over the past few days, but that obviously connect with the communities that we're here to uplift and support. And so we are here today again at the WHO Summit on Air Pollution and Health because we believe that the health community must see itself as a key actor in the global effort to phase out fossil fuels. As some of the world's most trusted messengers, the health community and the key entry point of air pollution is an essential component of making our demand effective. Phasing out fossil fuels is simply an environmental justice, human rights, and health equity issue. Taking action with urgency is key to protect the lives of those that are the most vulnerable or the most affected by air pollution while bearing the least responsibility for this crisis. Low-income communities, racialized communities, children, women, the elderly, and disabled people are the most affected by air pollution. For communities on the front lines of extraction, being choked by the dirty air in our car-clogged streets, or with no other choice than to burn dirty fuels to power their homes and their lives, the adoption of the Fossil Fuel Treaty would be a comprehensive solution to address the root cause of the climate crisis while promoting health equity. Fossil fuel combustion is choking our cities, and as the world continues to urbanize, 97% of cities in low and middle income countries have unsafe levels of air pollution. We've heard this also throughout the week, how urban climate action is essential. And yet, with 3/4 of global energy consumed in cities, we will need a just transition from fossil fuels to achieve urban health and well-being. We've heard very innovative and successful examples of urban decarbonization initiatives, but what I'd like to emphasize is that if we do not stop the root supply cause of the climate crisis, these benefits will be nullified. Importantly, from our perspective, a health-based transition will also imply a redefinition of what it means to create new energy systems, ones that protect everyone's health, that do not replicate the fossil fuel industry's exploitative model, and that ensure clean energy only for some groups at the expense of others. We believe that a health-based transition will need to hold these critical components, including, importantly, holding polluters accountable and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. Fossil fuels not only choke our lungs, they choke our public budgets that could be reallocated for critical health action. And so, on that note, I'd like to welcome on stage Jen Cole from the Global Climate and Health Alliance, who will be presenting new evidence for action. And if we could give Jen a round of applause. As I mentioned in my introduction, Jen will present some evidence from the upcoming report, and we're very excited about that. Over to you.
Amazing. Okay. Thanks so much for your patience. Let me just do a quick check. Amazing. Okay. Hi again. Echoing Lucas's thanks for being here on Friday morning. Your time is precious. Lots of what I'm going to share today, I have a sense that many of you will know it's going to echo what we've heard this week. But I'm going to try to wrap my arms around some of what we know and have been learning about the very distinct health impacts of fossil fuels from the moment they're extracted, or even before they're extracted, really, and through their use and into the waste management. So my name's Jen Kuhl. I'm the Network and Engagement Lead at the Global Climate and Health Alliance. GCHA is a network organization. Oh, yeah, there we go. With over 200 member organizations all over the world. And most of them are health and development organizations who feel very passionately about the intersection of the climate crisis and health, and are bringing this trusted health voice to the climate conversation. And one of the ways that our community, both GCHA members and more broadly with our networks and partners, have been very vocal is around the health impacts of fossil fuels, both for their massive contribution to the climate crisis and the global warming that is causing myriad health harms. I'd like to shout out the Lancet Countdown, which each year provides an incredible compilation of all of the health harms caused by the climate crisis. So the health community knows fossil fuels are causing the climate crisis and are deeply concerned about those health harms, from everything from clinics that are being destroyed by flooding to expanding infectious disease ranges. That's not the focus of this report, but always important to name that there are massive detrimental health consequences of the climate crisis. And so these are some ways that the health community has been coming out against fossil fuels. Obviously, most notably for this session is that GCHA, along with Healthcare Without Harm, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and the WHO Civil Society Working Group on Climate Change and Health, drafted the health letter calling for a fossil fuel treaty. Remarkably, that letter was signed by the World Health Organization, making it the first UN organization to call for a treaty, and showing, I think, really remarkable and clear-eyed leadership about the need to phase out fossil fuels. I also think that the health letter was the longest letter calling for a fossil fuel treaty, and the only letter with citations, because health people really care that the advocacy they are doing is based in evidence. And so it was long and had a rundown of all the health impacts of fossil fuels. And then to accompany that letter, GCHA produced this report called Cradle to Grave in 2022, where we outlined briefly some of the health impacts of fossil fuels themselves. The title is twofold. Fossil fuels harm us from before we're born, throughout our lives and into our elder years, and also are harming us from the beginning of site excavation, drilling, and extraction, all the way through combustion, use, and site repair and remediation. I don't know that I've ever seen anything quite as desolate as the reclamation site in northern Alberta, which is the photo on the left. And so we are doing an update of this report. We're doing a bit of a deep dive, and what I'm going to try to share today are a small sample of studies that have stood out to me. Again, we didn't do our own research. We did a lit review of recent research. And I'm going to focus them on the air pollution studies, but I wanted to know that there's evidence of health harms from water pollution and social harms that are caused by the fossil fuel industry showing up in a community. So they're not limited to air pollution, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to just highlight the air pollution related ones. We've been hearing all week about air pollution. I really liked this graphic from the International Energy Agency showing what amount of the pollutants that are harming our health and causing the climate crisis are coming from various forms. And you'll note that power, industry, transportation, and fuel supply are majorly connected to fossil fuels and are producing many of the much of the air pollution that is causing illness. Fossil fuels are also a cause of some of those super pollutants that we've been hearing about all week: black carbon, methane, and the pollutants that cause ozone, or problematic ozone. And just to note that climate change also does itself exacerbate air pollution. So whether it's from wildfires, from dust storms, as there was a presentation earlier this week, or from increasing heat, creating a better environment for the creation of tropospheric ozone. It's this terrifying loop. And I don't know, of climate, fossil fuels continuing to drive air pollution and in ill health in myriad ways. So one of the things GCHA does is we coordinate networks. One of the networks we coordinate is called On Air, and I think there's folks from that network in this room. And I think it was in February of 2023, we had some filmmakers from the BBC join an on-air call to tell us about a documentary they were making. And the feature of that documentary was a young man, a teenager, named Ali from Rumaila in Iraq. He lived near a BP oil site where there was consistent flaring. And the documentarians told us that Ali was battling leukemia, that he was a leader in his community, that he was speaking out for the many children who were also sick. We heard on that call, people were very moved. And I think it was proposed that maybe Ali would join us on a call to tell us about his experience in the coming months. Not too long after that, there was a fundraiser to try to get Ali to hospital because his cancer had accelerated. And in April 2023, he died of acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And he is only one child in Rumaila, and Rumaila is only one fossil fuel site. And I think his story made it to our ears by a series of coincidences. But we know there are so many thousands of children and so many families like Ali's family who suffer and whose stories go unheard and unseen. And so I wanted to start the conversation about the harms through the fossil fuel life cycle, talking about Ali, because I think it's important to ground us in people and in lives. And he was living near an extraction site. So that's the first thing. I'm not going to read all of these, but perhaps obviously we know that coal workers have coal workers, I'm going to mess it up if I try to say it, black lung disease. We've known that for years. We've known that since the 1800s. We also know coal workers have lung cancer, COPD, and other illnesses. We also see respiratory illness in communities near coal mines. So increased asthma, increased hospitalizations for respiratory and circulatory illnesses near in communities near mines, and also poor birth outcomes. Similarly, there's some really interesting recent research on oil and gas development. So I think something I'll speak to a little bit later is it can be really tricky to know whether a health impact is from a particular industrial site. So some of the studies that are really interesting are looking at when drilling was happening, did asthma hospitalizations go up? And a lot of the evidence suggests yes. So as do associations between when a pad is being prepared, when fracking is happening. Lots of the studies also look at proximity. So what are the health outcomes for babies born to mothers who live near unconventional gas sites? And perhaps what will stand out to you, as stood out to me, is the bottom study. And there are numbers, I have a citation list. I'm not going to show you the citation list today, but it exists if you want it. But the last study with children whose birth residence was 2 kilometers from a fracking well were twice as likely to develop acute lymphoblastic leukemia, that you'll note that's the same leukemia that killed Ellie. So there's a real theme with this particular leukemia and exposure to oil and gas. And I want to say here, again, when we look at death numbers, when we look at illness numbers, when we look at increased rates of asthma, we also need to remember that that's a family. That's a parent who had to take a day off work. That's a younger sibling who watched their older sibling be in the hospital. That's an entire life or an entire community's life that gets reoriented to caring for a sick child unnecessarily. Like, the children don't need to be sick. There's also some strong evidence between kids and adults who are near refineries around, again, the one from Saudi Arabia was interesting to me because you don't often think about hypertension in children. And similar stories from Canada and the studies from Canada and the US tracking, again, proximity to these refineries and ill health. There's also air pollution and health risks associated with transportation. So a coal train goes through your community and blows coal dust. You have the same exposures in some ways as a community living near mine. Also, when you have disasters like the Deepwater disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, there was evidence showing that during the time that that fire was burning, as you might expect, there was a huge amount of PM 2.5 and benzene that the surrounding communities were exposed to. And that can also be true when you have rail or pipeline disasters. And some disasters are not explosions. Some disasters are the leaks that happen in pipelines that are transporting fossil fuels. So again, this one sort of feels like a no-brainer, but important to include anyway. Coal-fired power plants, not good, not good for health. They're bad for the climate and they're bad for our health. And I think if I was gonna point out a low-hanging fruit of air pollution and climate action, it would be a rapid move away from coal-fired power. Because it's associated with lung cancer, asthma, heart attacks and strokes, and again, with poor birth outcomes. And there's less research on gas-fired power plants, but HEAL did a really excellent report a couple years back outlining some of the health impacts of Europe's gas-fired power plants and the potential cost to the European economy. I keep wanting to advance the slides on my computer, which is not where they are. We've also, I think having Rosamund start this conference with Ella's story was so grounding, and like Ali's story is one I think about a lot. Because not only is there such a strong association between the traffic and traffic-related pollution near Ella's home, there are numerous studies that back that up. Traffic-related air pollution is associated with increased asthma visits for children, Again, with childhood leukemia, there seems to be an association between risks of developing COPD and possibly type 2 diabetes. There also seem to be links between traffic proximity and brain health, so around Parkinson's and dementia. There's also a subset of studies that really focus on diesel and diesel ill health. And someone was reminding me the other day that a thing we'd missed in this already very long report that I'm not sure is going to be a thing I'm going to be able to address, but is like diesel from shipping is another way that communities are exposed. And there's also a subset of studies that I found interesting and concerning about the health risks of living near gas stations or working near gas stations. So again, an elevated risk for children who live near gas and petrol stations of some leukemias and ill health, and for gas station workers. And I think those pinpoint health risks are interesting because we care about the health of those families, but also because one can assume, if you think about dosage, if a person who works in a space gets sick, those exposures aren't great for us, the rest of us either. I wanted to highlight this because there's a couple things that I've learned in doing this review that seem to be challenging about researching the health impacts of fossil fuels. And one of them is how do you parse out the air pollution that is from fossil fuels and from other types of industry? Or if you're looking at traffic, what of it is from the exhaust and what of it is from tires, for example. And that's where you're getting some of these like proximity studies. There's also, in some of them, it's kind of hard to tell what caused the harm. Like, was it fracking, or was it all the cars that showed up in a community and all the trucks that showed up in the community to drill at the fracking site? I'm gonna suggest that it doesn't necessarily matter. It's interesting, perhaps, what part of the fossil fuel process is linking to the health harm, but it doesn't matter that much if there's this ongoing evidence that living in proximity to the fossil fuel industry or to a place of combustion is bad for your health. There's also challenges because many of the worst outcomes of fossil fuel exposure are long latency illnesses. So you get an exposure at birth and then you might get leukemia many years later and your family may have moved. So it can be hard to tie that, to quantify and find all of the health impacts of these fossil fuel exposures, because it can take some time for the illnesses to develop. And I think that's why you see so many studies that look at asthma and birth outcomes, because those are a shorter time period. You also have, in some areas, smaller population sizes. So like in northern Alberta, where you have a community living near the tar sands, that community is several hundred people. If they see 3 cases of the same cancer that is rare and unusual, you shouldn't see that in that number, but it's also not enough people for an effect size in like a proper study. And so that can be really challenging when a community is saying, we're sick in ways we were never sick before, and the academic community is like, we can't prove it with your numbers. There's also, I'll wrap up soon, but there's also challenges around, in many regions of the world, industry control. So researchers or health professionals who try to go in and raise the alarm, community members who try to raise the alarm are at risk of persecution, or data goes missing, air pollution monitors go missing, people can't get permits, people get threatened with losing their medical licenses if they speak up. It's hard to get data out of these places. And also, I think it needs to be said that many of the communities whose health has been most harmed are communities who are facing other kinds of oppression and who might have limited access to power within the government system they're working in. So Indigenous communities, Black and Brown communities, communities who live on industry has an easier time putting an industrial project near a community that the people in power already don't like. It can be, what I mostly want to say is just because just because the research is limited in an area or about a particular type of fossil fuel, that doesn't mean no harm is happening. The fact that there's way more research on the health impacts of fracking in Philadelphia than there is on the health impacts of oil in Nigeria does not mean there's no health impacts of oil in Nigeria. It just means it's really hard to get evidence out of there. And when communities are telling us that they are seeing harms, that their health is suffering, that their children are ill, we need to believe them, even if their studies aren't there to back them up, because people's lives and stories are also valid evidence. So I'm not suggesting that we need more evidence to act, but because what exists is robust. And we have talked about the sort of tangible ways we're subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. I would say that the health sector is also subsidizing the fossil fuel industry because we are paying for all these health impacts. Health workers are caring for sick children and sick families. We are bearing the costs of harm done by the industry. So when you get governments saying we can't afford to transition to clean energy, it's too costly, it's simply not true. We're already paying for it. We're paying for it with our health, and we're paying for it with our lives. I'm going to close on something hopeful. My favorite studies are the evidence that things get better when you move away from fossil fuel power. So we've got these 3 studies about power plants where when they close, you get less asthma or better neurocognitive development or a reduction in preterm births. And that feels really hopeful to me. That in the same way that if you stop smoking, your lungs will recover over time. If we stop using fossil fuels, we will get healthier. And I also think that there's an incredible opportunity, which I'm excited to have this panel talk about, of moving to renewables for providing communities who have not previously had access to energy in the unjust fossil fuel system. So the last person on the left is a woman named Melina, who's from Little Buffalo First Nation in northern Alberta. And she has been an activist against the oil sands for years, and recently has moved into equipping Indigenous communities with renewables. And the first project they worked on was getting solar panels on their clinic, their health clinic. And similarly, I heard the health minister from Sierra Leone once say, a baby's not going to wait for whether or not you have diesel to run your generator. The baby's going to be born when the baby wants to be born. This is an opportunity for health facilities to have ongoing electricity from things like solar, so that there is electricity when you need it. And so I think that's one of the reasons I'm excited about the fossil fuel treaty and this mechanism to shift us away from health harming energies and towards energies that might give us actually more consistent access to healthcare and certainly cleaner air.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move into the conversational segment of this morning. It is the last day of an intensive conference, and I would just like to announce that unfortunately Dr. Neira is unable to join us, but we're very lucky to have Heather Rouhani, the acting unit head of air quality, energy, and health of the WHO, that will be stepping in, and we're going to have a quick conversation moderated by Alex Rafalowitz, who is the executive director of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. So if you'd like to join me on stage, there are some mics and there's some water. And please give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. And thank you, Jen. I think that was a really powerful introduction for some of us and reintroduction for many of us on the way that fossil fuels present a cradle-to-grave risk to health, and from the very cradle of their extraction to the sad grave in our atmosphere, that every step in that process presents a risk to human health. So really appreciate the work that you and the Global Climate and Health Alliance have done in bringing that information together. So thank you for setting the scene for us. Heather, we're really delighted that you are joining us. You've probably been to 10, 15 of these types of sessions this week. So we wanted to just start by inviting you to offer some reflections on what have been some of the biggest themes you've heard at this conference over the last couple of days.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me. And again, Dr. Onera really regrets there's, as you can know, that's kind of a wild time at the moment at WHO, so there was an emergency resource meeting so that she had to attend, but she is going to try to swing by to say her hellos, as she really wanted to be here. So yeah, this week has been wild, but really exciting, I have to say. We really aimed in this conference to bring the scientific communities, civil societies together, as well as government leaders together, so that we can really ensure that we can promote this kind of evidence-based action on air pollution. And of course, fossil fuels is like the source of air pollution if we talk about it. So it was really nice to hear that we're really building the health argument for actually transitioning away from fossil fuels, and really as that is a key measure to address air pollution essentially and the health impacts. And as alluded to earlier, the actual whole energy value chain is massively polluting. Everything from finding the fossil fuels to extracting it and then to burning it. And that is a real massive health crisis. So having the health community really come together as a way to push that forward and leverage that forward is great. And that we heard a lot of that through this conference. If you were going through different rooms, fossil fuels I think was raised in almost every discussion in some way or another, and how we need to move away from that is really critical, and really having everyone really contribute to that. And there was this also these solutions, right? There were opportunities that were really highlighted, and how we can really, there are things that we can do as the health community, the environment community, and even the energy community. There are these solutions.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, it's certainly something that we heard throughout the week. We were in a room just across the hall on the first day, and we heard voices from across the Americas about their experience with fracking plants in their communities and the risks that they had posed to health from New York State to Mexico to here in Colombia and in Argentina as well. And so I was wondering, in talking about what are our opportunities for supporting the exit from fossil fuels and the fair phase out of fossil fuels, whether there were signs that you'd seen this week that you feel like really point us in the direction of where we need to travel for the fair phase out of fossil fuels?
For sure, there were definitely enough evidence displayed by a variety of different experts showing that we need to transition away from that, and we need to find the solutions. But we need to do that in a just and inclusive way, right? That we cannot leave the poorest of the poor behind in this transition. But my goodness, the largest sources of air pollution are coming from those countries who are burning fossil fuels. Not the ones that have, typically the ones that are not contributing are those that don't even have access to clean energy sources, period. So we need to be really taking the opportunity to lead by example in those places that we can. The transition can happen now, and it should have started decades ago, right? We have the evidence to move forward. It's impacting all sorts of aspects of public health in general, and it's really important. I mean, at my heart, public health comes to really upstream action that we need to be driving. It's not about treating the patient, it's about preventing the disease. And this is where there are opportunities in that way to do that, and that we as a global health community, WHO, all the organizations, scientists, and ministries, right? These are the key people driving it. We have to act together to really push this forward.
Applause for that. That, for me, I guess, was one of the conversation through lines that I feel like I saw in a couple of the rooms, which is around when we're thinking about transitioning and access to energy for people who are being most marginalized or excluded by the existing system. One of the key questions is how do we provide in households, particularly cook stoves, and how do we grapple with the real risk that gas represents to human health, both at the household level, but also if we look at the meta trends around gas use and the challenges there. And I wonder if you've had some reflections from that risk of gas.
Yes, I would say that this is, I've been working in household energy since the start of my career, and I go to many, many, many energy meetings. I'm like the kind of the odd person out. I go to these energy meetings, they're all having lunches, and I don't know all the energy community, but now they know me, right? I'm the health person. I'm the odd one out in general. I think that it's a very, very tricky question, right? And it's very difficult from the health community. This is why we are really trying at WHO. We have our indoor air quality guidelines for household fuel combustion. We are fuel and technology agnostic. We are aiming for the emission rate targets that are set by the science. And at the moment, this is what, there's different choices. And then we have these recommendations, right? There's certain emission rate targets, but there is also a recommendation in there that people often forget, is that in places where you can transition to the cleanest of the clean, you should. And there's no excuse for not transitioning to that. I was quite shocked that we had a member state, I understood, I have to be neutral, right, in what I say, and I am a nonpartisan, who actually, a high-income country, was great opportunity to be really transitioning to renewable, clean electricity all over the place, and they're justifying using that transition to going ahead and putting a bunch of natural gas in place because WHO considers that a clean fuel. That's not what WHO says. WHO says that we must transition to the cleanest thing possible to protect health. And if you have the opportunity to transition to something that's the cleanest of the clean, that's what you should be doing to protect your public health. Don't be using our guidelines as an excuse, right? Our guidelines are very much for a specific population, right? And therefore, it's really for those populations that have absolutely nothing. There are still opportunities, I'm sorry, to protect health in the next couple decades on LPG. I have to be clear, that's what the science says, but we are also working very hard, for example, with the Modern Energy Cooking Solutions Group and others, to really also push solar induction stoves and these types of things. And that's where we're working in this idea of clean stacking, right? And again, countries need to prioritize the cleanest they can do based on their resources, and there's not going to be just one solution. And that's what I've been telling the energy community, that we can't be just focusing on LPG, we need to focus on LPG, biogas, solar induction stoves, etc., to really make sure that the transition is accessible to all, it's affordable, and something that everyone can use in the long term. So there's no excuse for high-income countries to be saying, yeah, we're going to put a bunch of pipelines in for natural gas because that's what WHO says, and it's not. We are prioritizing health as the crux, and that's whatever a country can do to use those resources is the way that we should go.
Thanks, Heather. I think there's more applause than people like, right, I can go home and be like, that is not what the WHO, I was there. That is not what they said. So that's great. I did want to, reflecting on, I guess, some of the motivation around the idea of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which is something that the WHO has supported the call for, and the countries that are beginning to discuss it, has been that one of the risks with the fossil fuel system is that of lock-in. The decision that we make today about the infrastructure is the infrastructure we'll have in 20 years. And so every choice we make today, as you were saying, like, it needs to be the cleanest possible. But are there risks around us now if we are, I don't want to misquote you, but to say, technology agnostic at the household level, we actually miss the larger health impact of locking ourselves into more gas consumption and use and production systems. And LPG might be disconnected, but that what actually they're driving to do is build piped gas connections, and that once you have those, it's going to be much harder to, I actually don't like the word transition because we're talking about people who maybe don't yet have the use of fossil fuels, so it's actually hooking them up to the addiction to that system, which is driving a broader health crisis. And I just, wonder if you have some reflections on the risks around lock-in and how to manage the potential trade-offs there.
Yes, I would say I have to think about this, right? I would definitely think that, in fact, we are not promoting the idea, and I can tell countries, and I have supported member states saying, no, you don't need to be putting in a bunch of natural gas pipelines, particularly considering the global warming potential of methane and these things that are coming off of that. This is not necessarily the way. But in some places where LPG is available, it's a byproduct, and it's already there, it can be used, right? And the infrastructure for LPG is not huge, so you put it up and you can take it down fairly quickly, right? And I as a public health professional, cannot say, oh, this household can't use LPG for the next 10, they can't have access to clean cooking for the next 10, 20 years. because they need to wait for them to have full infrastructure for renewable electricity, for example. So LPG is a solution, but we're definitely not the idea of promoting building massive infrastructure, gas pipelines, et cetera, as the means for a long-term solution, right? This is not something that we're aiming for. We need to be really working at what's available at that time and in those particular resources. And for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, LPG is an available fuel that can really help this transition, but it needs to be done in cooperation and consideration of other clean energy sources at the same time.
Thanks, Heather. Maybe actually even leaving off there, if we're talking about the idea of a possible treaty that's to try and address the proliferation of fossil fuels and try and create incentives for countries and jurisdictions to say, no, we're going to draw a line, we don't need any new fossil fuel infrastructure. What would be, because this treaty has not yet been developed, what would be the types of ideas that you think would be a great contribution to a new international agreement? What types of international cooperation would help make sure that countries or communities can make that healthiest choice? Or would there be some broader practice from the Tobacco Convention or from other WHO practices that you think we should consider as we develop this idea?
I think the Tobacco Convention is an interesting reference point because it really provides that mandate, right? And it is something that member states agreed to. It creates that regulations and it has a secretariat that pushes it forward. It provides specific actions that the health sector needs to take and others need to take in addressing it. And so that we could do that for fossil fuels, for example. And in that discussion, one would again have to really discuss and make sure, for example, the access issue, that we are making sure that we are not leaving those behind. It is just and inclusive, and then prioritizing that via evidence. So this is what WHO is trying to do, is provide the tools and resources for member states and other countries to analyze and to evaluate what are the best options for them now and in the future, and then those projections. And we would, in that treaty, we could provide some specific recommendations that, you know, if you have the opportunity, you need to be transitioning completely away, right? And there's no need to go further. And that you also have this idea that it provides the accountability as well, because I think that's something that happens a lot. We have a lot of empty promises in this world, and we need to make sure that there is some accountability, and that's what a framework provides, is that member states will need to come and report back as to what they're doing, and they have no excuses because we would provide the tools and resources for them to make informed decisions. And in general, we know that we're going to see positives from phasing out, particularly for those countries already very advanced in their energy and very reliant on fossil fuels in their homes.
And the broader economy. No, thank you. I think those reflections are really helpful for us as this movement goes about trying to build the most robust and powerful international agreement to accelerate the just transition, the importance of that accountability and reporting and the lessons from the Tobacco Convention. We're coming to the end of our conversation. Really appreciate you jumping up at the last minute and everything you've done through the week. Is there a last message that you would like folks to take away? I think they've got clear that the WHO is not endorsing gas. I don't know if there was anything else that you hope that folks take away from their time in Cartagena.
Thanks. No, I'm happy to be here again. It was sorry I wasn't super well prepared, but just to say, I do think there is an environmental health justice issue here. And I think that, as alluded to, there's many health impacts that need to be really looked at across the energy value chain, from the start to the finish. And I think that sometimes air pollution, of course, is an important entry point, but we should really be looking more and better calculating and looking at those health risks throughout, whether that's extraction, whether that's distribution, et cetera, refinement, et cetera. So this is something that we as the health community need to do, is build the strongest evidence we can and quantifying that and really providing the evidence to say this is why we need to transition. I think it's also key that we as the health community, we have a massive convening power, right? These are elected officials often, right? Who allocate the ministers and things. They want positive. So we have a voice from the health community. We have the trusted voice of the health community, the trusted voice of doctors. We have the trusted voice of public health professionals calling for a transition, providing the evidence needed. you can't argue with that, and because you have the civilians who are going to call for action, and these people need to be elected again. So the more we can provide them with the fuel to power this argument to a cleaner energy future, that would be great. Also, to comment on the idea there is so many opportunities with clean and renewable energy in terms of, when we need is the health sector to be leading by example. We are really promoting, for example, renewable energy in healthcare facilities for those places that have none. I went to Somalia, I went to health clinics with absolutely no electricity, and I've seen what a renewable electricity can do for those facilities that had none, and it was really, really shocking, but so much opportunity with the transition that can help in delivery of healthcare services.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much for the conversation here right now, but also the conversations that you've helped catalyze across these last few days in Cartagena. I think they've been quite historic in bringing together the connections between air pollution, human health, and also the climate crisis. And good luck with the rest of your leadership on this issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather and Alex. If I could invite our panelists to come up on stage, Mirto, Vavreen, Madeline, Sandra, as well as our moderator for the upcoming discussion, Aparna Bose, who's a senior correspondent at Press Trust India, and I'm very delighted to introduce her. And if we could all give the panelists a round of applause, we'll be diving into a conversation from a social movements perspective on bringing the fight to fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. Before we begin this session, I would like to give a little description about what it is about. Across the globe, fossil fuel use and production have harmed the health, and it also harms the livelihoods of people who are living in and around coal, oil, and gas sites. The most vulnerable amongst us are low-income communities, children, the pregnant, and the elderly. The communities are more susceptible to the impacts of exposure to pollution as a result of pre-existing health disparities, and phasing out of fossil fuel is therefore a crucial step towards achieving environmental justice, human rights, and health equity. This session will focus on efforts from civil society to highlight these health harms while also offering solutions rooted in environmental justice and sustainable energy resources for all. Before we begin the session, I would want my speakers to introduce themselves, and then we'll start the conversation. Thank you.
I am Sandra Steingraber. I'm a PhD biologist who serves as senior scientist for the Science and Environmental Health Network in the United States, and I live in New York.
Hi. Is it working? Yes. Oh, it's okay. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Ruta Tilianaki. I'm the Senior Advocate of the Environment Team at Human Rights Watch.
Hi, everybody. I'm Madeline McGillivray. I live in New York. I am the Climate Justice Lead for the organization Seeding Sovereignty, and I have over 10 years of microplastics and fossil fuel advocacy and science research. Thank you.
I'm Bhavreen Kandhari, and I'm from Warrior Moms in India. We're a group of mothers who are working, towards clean air for all our children across India.
Thank you. Bhavreen, I want to start with you first. Warrior Moms is a group that's leading the fight on the ground. It's a grassroots level movement. If you could tell us more about the movement and how it resonates with the fossil fuel treaty demands, with your demands that you are putting forth.
Sure, thank you, Aparna. So, of course, it's very much what I think all are saying. I mean, I'm also going to take on from what Heather said just now, that every room here has been resonating on fossil fuels, and we are all, whether we are working on clean air, and the clean air is directly connected with fossil fuels, and that's what we have been pointing out, to the point that even at the conference we are here with a quilt where we featured from India a child who's in a coal block, it's called, the state is Jharkhand and it's called Jharia, where there are, these crevices, the fire hasn't stopped burning for 100 years. So they're actually living there and they're, bearing the brunt of this toxicity of, from PM 2.5 to sulfur dioxide to benzene, this is, and there's nothing more to say, and Jen has very clearly shown the effects of health, so I will not repeat that. So this is these are the objectives that we see, and even a few years ago when I spoke of fossil treaty, I always said that for us, fossil fuel treaty is like the litmus test. It's like any country or city who's hesitant and refuses to abide by that or sign that means they're really not serious about this. So they are, you may want to show data, and as governments you want to, show, various policy, etc. But you don't mean business, because business is that fossil fuels need to go and clean energy should come in. So this is our, connect with fossil fuel treaty, and this is how our objectives very clearly follow fossil treaty. And fossil fuel kills. I mean, this is something we say probably every day of our lives. And so are the dignitaries saying that over here. Even the politicians are saying that. The parents are saying that. Mothers like us. Scientists are saying that. Human rights advocates are saying that. But then why isn't it happening? So fossil fuel treaty is what helps us, take that route and make sure that, even if nobody's listening, but we in India also, we are taking it to our states, whether now at this point we're working on Karnataka, now in Jharkhand, and that's a coal block, so obviously they will never like to hear things like this. And recently our Prime Minister's also, he was celebrating the 1 billion mark that we've made, ton mark that we made of coal just a couple of days ago. So it's a very difficult situation for India, because we are the second largest coal consumers. Even we're taking a coal as the second largest country. But it's difficult to do that. But obviously the health cost of it, the health impact that's having. These are the stories. These are the various featured. Like this child on the quilt we have is a clear indication of why fossil fuels need to go and renewable energy will have to come in, and with a different pace. That's what, and so anyway.
Great. Thank you. I think this particular topic also needs more media coverage in India so that people are more aware of this particular thing. Dr. Sadra, coming to you. For several decades, you have bridged the gap between the world of science and activism. And alongside your colleagues at Concerned Health Professionals of New York, you have also worked on health harms of fracking. Could you tell us more about these health harms and a little about your successful campaign on ban fracking in New York City that you were a part of?
Yes, thank you. I'll start by saying I was a scientist before I became an activist. I've had a microscope since I was 9 years old. And became an activist around fracking, like so many people, when fracking arrived in my village in upstate New York, where we woke up one day and discovered gas industry vans parked everywhere in the village, and we felt that we were being occupied by an army. And indeed, the gas industry told us, without irony, that fracking has arrived and resistance is futile. That was something they said in the newspaper. And so I decided to use what I knew as a biologist to help inform the activists who were organizing against this. And I brought with me also my identity as a mother of a child with asthma, and my understanding that part of the land that had already been leased for fracking was right at the end of my block. So either we were going to win and ban fracking in New York State, or I was going to have to move. And so I fought with my whole heart. And I felt that the gift that I had to offer this movement, because I'm not an organizer, I'm very shy, actually. I'm not good at talking to people, but I could do the research and do the data. And so I banded together with a group of other scientists and health professionals, and we began to review the peer-reviewed science that we had access to because we were at Cornell and various different colleges. And so we pulled the science out of the peer-reviewed literature and translated it into plain language, into a compendium. And we brought this before our elected officials as well as people in the community. So we said we wanted to inform our elected leaders, and we did. And we called that Speaking Truth to Power. But we also wanted to educate people on the front lines, and we called that Speaking Truth to Powerlessness, and empower them to feel like they could participate in the political process. And so when we wrote the first edition of our compendium, there were only 65 studies in the peer-reviewed literature, and they were troubling. And then a year later, we released another edition, and there were now 150 studies. And then by the time we pushed the governor into banning fracking in New York, there were 400 studies. So we felt ourselves like assembling a jigsaw puzzle. Each piece was one study, and we began to assemble them into a compendium, and as a picture began to emerge. And after we banned fracking, everyone around the world was interested in our compendium, and so I quit my job at the university and now work full-time doing this work. And so our compendium now looks like this. You used to be able to staple it. It was only a few pages long. Now it's more than 500 pages, and there are 2,500 studies demonstrating the risk and harm for fracking for the climate and for public health. And so the jigsaw puzzle now picture is very clear. And you've heard already what some of these studies are. I won't repeat them. Clearly, fracking is bad for pregnant women and harms infants before they're even born. Yes, there are many incidents of leukemia among children. We have good data from Pennsylvania and also from Colorado. There's another kind of cancer called Ewing sarcoma that we're seeing in the bone cancer we're seeing in Pennsylvania. I would add to that story that at the other end of life, among old people, they are especially susceptible. Old people who live near fracking sites die sooner, and they have more hospitalizations for heart failure and heart attack. Yes, it's an environmental justice issue. We see brown and black people those communities being harmed worse, and we see that fracking operations target those communities for their operations. So I'll close by saying one thing I haven't heard discussed yet is that fracking is a permanent source of air pollution. Once you drill a well into the shale, which is not only full of methane, but also because these are vaporized corpses of prehistoric animals, they turn into many different hydrocarbons. And that includes formaldehyde, a carcinogen, benzene, ethane, propane, butane. I could go on and on. Once that well is formed, it will start to leak. And wells always leak sooner or later, as this cement and steel, which they are made of, are not immortal substances. As they begin to rust and crumble, there's no putting a plug in the top because they leak from outside the well casing. So these giant cigarettes that go into the earth for fracking will continue to create air pollution. World without end, amen, for all of eternity. And so we document this in our compendium along with everything else. And what the conclusion we reach with this is that fracking is ungovernable. There are no set of rules or regulations that can make fracking not contribute to air pollution. And this is before the gas is even burned. So that, I think, argument was very powerful. And we did see in 2014, the governor's health commissioner repeat to us on television some of the language from our compendium as the reason for banning fracking. That was a triumphant moment for me as a scientist to see that science prevailed. However, I now understand that it would not have won had we not built out a huge social movement, which terrified the governor and threatened his political career, because we were now a bigger threat to his ambitions than the gas industry. And so activism and science must work together. If we defeated Goliath as David, and our slingshot was made of science, love, and grassroots political power.
Thank you, Sandra. Marta, coming to you. Am I saying your name right? Marta, right. Human Rights Watch have been conducting work with fence-line communities and around the world and uplifting their demands for clean energy and stricter regulations. Can you tell us more about your work and highlight some of the examples of struggles to end direct human harms inherent to fossil fuel projects that Human Rights Watch has recently covered?
Thank you. And maybe before I describe some of the examples and the risk of reiterating a lot of what you've probably heard in the last few days, I just wanted to go back to why fossil fuels threaten fundamental human rights. You've heard today and in previous days that the burning of fossil fuels is the primary driver of the climate crisis and a major source of air pollution, threatening core human rights such as the right to life, the right to health, the right to water, to food, and so on. And fossil fuel production, as we've heard this morning, causes human rights harms at all stages. And the last point I want to highlight is that not everyone's rights are impacted the same way. The most severe impacts tend to fall on communities that are already marginalized, such as communities of color, low-income communities, and indigenous communities. And so Human Rights Watch has documented the devastating impact of air pollution from the fossil fuel and petrochemical industry in many parts of the world. In case you don't know Human Rights Watch well, the way we work is we conduct investigations on human rights violations, we publish reports with our evidence, and then we do direct advocacy with policymakers at the local, national, or international level. And when we say that we try to uplift local demands, what we mean is we either do direct advocacy, as I just mentioned, pushing for regulatory changes, and we also hope that our evidence can help support communities in litigation efforts or other regulatory pushes. So going back to the examples, I want to give a couple. The first one is from Louisiana, Louisiana's Cancer Alley. We did a report last year highlighting the devastating toll of extreme pollution on Cancer Alley residents caused by the fossil fuel and petrochemical industry. Cancer Alley refers to an 85-mile stretch of communities that live side by side with about 200 plants that expose them to the highest cancer risk and toxic pollution levels in the United States, causing maternal, reproductive, newborn health issues, but also respiratory and other health problems. And these impacts are especially borne by Cancer Alley's Black residents. So in this case, Human Rights Watch called for increased regulations, better enforcement of existing environmental laws, and a phase out of fossil fuels, supporting local calls for moratoria on new or expanded fossil fuel and petrochemical operations, echoing calls by local communities. And it's interesting to note that, local communities in Cancer Alley have called for better enforcement of regulations, but at the end of the day, the question that they were asking themselves is, can you regulate this problem away? And the answer was no. So grassroots groups like RISE, St. James have long opposed new fossil fuel and petrochemical plants because they don't trust that the industry can operate safely. And they have, in the meantime, led some successful litigation cases. Shifting gears and geographic locations, the second example I wanted to give is that of a Turkish coal power plant in Afshin Elbistan, southeastern region of Turkey, where we found dangerously high air pollution levels near one of the country's coal power plants called Afshin Elbistan. And people living close to the plant described to us, a myriad of health issues linked to toxic air, including cancer, respiratory ailments, cardiovascular diseases, etc. And through this report, we called on Turkey not to approve the addition of 2 more units to the coal plant, warning of severe health risks to the local population. Unfortunately, the government approved last January the expansion of the coal power plant. But in response, local residents have already filed 4 lawsuits challenging the governmental expansion of coal power plants and calling for a transition away from coal in the country. But something I also wanted to highlight about this specific case is the lack of information that residents shared with us. And echoing what UN Special Rapporteur on the right to a clean and healthy environment said the other day about the procedural rights that are a crucial part of the right to a clean and healthy environment. Residents living in near villages close to the plant told us that they did not receive any information about the risks from plants in the region or how to help protect themselves. And finally, I was in Bulgaria last February, again, conducting an investigation on one of the oldest power plants in the country, that regularly exceeds air pollution standards and has been shut down numerous times. And in that town called Dimitrovgrad, local residents have created a sort of WhatsApp group where they collate data from monitoring stations daily or hourly, and they try to share, understand, interpret that data, and then issue warnings amongst themselves. And although that is an impressive form of organizing, it shouldn't fall on individuals to analyze that sort of deeply technical information. The government has a duty to disseminate that sort of information and issue warnings to protect people's health. Thank you.
Thank you, Myrtle. Madeline, I want to come to you. You've been a climate activist since childhood and particularly focused on plastics. Over 99% of plastics are made of fossil fuels. So I want to ask you that, can you highlight some of the health harms of plastic and discuss the importance of fossil fuel phase out in context of ongoing plastics negotiations too?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. As you mentioned, I have been in this world, like a lot of us, since I was small, like Sandra, 9 years old. I grew up with a mother who was a nonprofit environmental lawyer, single mother, and we traveled around to places on the front lines that were communities being harmed by fossil fuel extraction. And I got not only to meet superheroes in these communities, but really to be mentored by a lot of them. Communities in Ecuador and Amazon fighting Chevron, folks in Appalachia fighting mountaintop removal. And, I recall standing on the last remaining mountain in basically as far as the eye can see. It was a true hellscape. Every other mountain had been literally decimated. And that has shaped my perspective of climate justice and the work that we do at the organization that I run with my mom called Seeding Sovereignty, which is a focus on plastics and particularly microplastics. So being part of these conversations and hearing everything that we've heard the last few days, I would like to highlight that as we talk about air pollution, if you are a health professional, if you are an advocate, if you are any kind of an official, we must incorporate microplastics in the conversation of air pollution. There's always research being published because this is a newer field on the health harms of microplastics and plastics. But just 3 days ago, on the 25th, a lit review of 3,000 studies found that places that have higher concentrations of plastic and have higher microplastic levels are seriously correlated with non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, etc. And I want to speak to the fact that there's always going to be new research. We have a lot of exposure data, just like Sandra's holding a massive binder of research. And yet we must employ the precautionary principle when we talk about health in regards to microplastics. So I like to think about the fact that microplastics are important in this conversation from the lens of, the cradle to the grave, as we talk about. So obviously communities that we get to work with and that have been mentioned and that we want to amplify at all times, mostly Black and brown communities, folks in Louisiana, other areas that are fighting at the front lines of fossil fuel extraction, are dealing with
plastics, a lot of the refineries of plastics, and the fact that the pollution that results at the end of the life cycle when gas gets fracked, when oil gets pumped, it is microplastics. So you mentioned, and oftentimes we talk about the fact that plastic is like plan B for the oil and gas industry. I would say that it's not like a future thing. It's currently happening, right? Fossil fuel industry is aiming to, inexorably increase, right, their plastics production, and it's happening right now. Yeah, so we kind of have to reframe the conversation a little bit to think about, okay, we're not just talking about oil and gas, we're talking also about microplastics. And to speak specifically to the health implications of microplastics, I'd like to highlight that, my background is in the research. I work with the scientists who are leading the way on this topic. I am not actively a scientist, and I work to sort of kind of bridge the silos, right? How do we actually communicate about these things? So I bring a lens of the rigor and the accuracy of the scientific community to the fact that we are also at kind of the frontier of understanding the health implications of microplastics. And my thesis on this is that, kind of drawing a similarity to the cigarette industries that used to be super unregulated, and the industry sowing lots of doubt, realizing that when we look at plastic, and specifically when we look at microplastics in the human body, we have tons of exposure data, right? We know that they're in our brains. We know that they pass through the placenta. We know that they pass through the blood-brain barrier. Nanoplastics are small enough to infiltrate cells. And this is extremely alarming, yet there is increasing research that is really compelling on what that actually means. So I would encourage folks to look at some of the cardiovascular data, to look at some of the fact that, there's a lot of emerging data on fertility. So my kind of thesis, and perhaps we'll get to this as well later in the conversation, but when we talk about microplastics as part of the fossil fuel ecosystem and air pollution, from a public health lens, we don't want to be alarmist. The data is not extremely clear yet we know that plastics are toxic, and we know that they are seriously impacting maternal fetal health and fertility. And as human beings, it's important that we know who we're talking to, and from the perspective of kind of who we are on an evolutionary basis and what piques our interest, fertility is a really compelling topic. So, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Manu. Thank you so much for your insights. Bhavin, coming back to you, when we talk about pollution in India, we often talk about Delhi. Delhi is one of the most focused cities. But we don't know much about Rajasthan and other places, most importantly, places like Jharkhand, where we see air pollution from fossil fuels. If you could tell us more about that, and what imperative of just transition is essential for these kind of places like Jharkhand?
Yeah, so thank you, Parna. But yes, of course, we speak more on Delhi because it's a narrative that has been said for many years that it was Delhi, it's polluted, it's pretty much pan-India. And also even Delhi, see Delhi is, when you talk about Jharkhand, is the extraction where, the fossil fuels being extracted, and that is why the pollution affects, the people who are living there. And Delhi would be because, again, it is fossil fuel because it's now being consumed there, the vehicular emissions, etc., primarily the reason why we face the pollution and the PM 2.5. So it's every place has it. Every region has its own reasons. They have their own chemistry. They have their own ways of dealing with it. And just transition, as far as just transition is concerned, now I'll come back to Jharkhand and try to put that Jharia image, when we were trying to put this image on the quilt, a child's image, a 12-year-old child who's been practically since 10 years, he's been going to a hospital every month. And, there were many pictures we shared with the printer to print, and he kept saying the other cities were fine with the world that they were printing. He said they're too dark. So I said, how can they be dark? Because these pictures are actually coming from a professional photographer, somebody who's actually dedicated his life and time. Now he's bringing in these stories through his photography, and we are connected. So I know they're very high resolution. So they were dark because every child is full of coal. They are just laden with the fly ash, and that was so, because even it took me, I had to go back to the files and look at them. I said, oh, it's not dark. This is what it is. This is how they are looking. This is how they are 24/7, every minute of their lives. So not only here in Odisha, we have a warrior mom who's fighting for now almost 2.5 years, and I've spoken about this earlier also here with Fossil Treaty, that there's a train that passes the village every day, and they offload the coal, and then they mix some chemicals and put it back, but that process causes a huge amount of fly ash that comes into the village, and every child practically has breathing problems, and people who are facing this. So now, what do you say? What will be the just transition for this? Now, the government in Jharkhand, in Jharia, they've moved them. What moved them for? 15 kilometers away or 20 kilometers away? Does that really do justice? No. So just transition has become also a term, when the various political leaders are manipulating that word and trying to show that, yes, we've done it, but first, can anyone come and tell us to move our home? Is it that easy? You just can't. Nobody wants to move. This is your home. It'll never be just that you're moving. All right, now because you're working on that and you're moving them and trying to pretend like this is just. It'll never be just. So that is the reason that people resist, and those villagers were resisting. Just about a couple of weeks ago, there were a stray dog entered that huge, crevice of fire. The toddler, crawled into, the thing, because it's, these are things that are absolutely inhuman. When we're talking of art, like in India, we call it Article 21 of Constitution, that's right to life, and how does it justify that? And no one should have to actually go through it. And just transition is, again, I'm coming back to it, that's a very relative term it's become, and we need to put these specific guidelines, or somebody like Fossil Treaty can only help us push that there have to be certain ways of bringing in bringing in real I don't know what even to say this, because when I speak, I just get these pictures, and I just I get angry. It just makes me so upset, because it's over the years and years you're just saying this, doing this, but it's costing these children their lives. It's costing these people their lives. It's costing us, whether we are in Delhi, and like I always say that I'm fighting for clean air maybe over 25 years, but my daughters have damaged lungs. So there is no choice, we are just, it's something you can't pause, that okay, I'll stop breathing, and we'll pause it, and then we'll clean it, and then we'll give it to you again. So why is it that there's no urgency? Why is it that we are all on the same page, and you hear everyone saying the same things? But one of my friends who said here, and I will re-quote that we may have plans, everyone has plans, but a plan without an action is like a dream. It's just a dream. So this is I call Fossil Treaty in action. Plans everybody has, every country has plans. This is the action to make it really happen.
Thank you, Gauri. Continue our conversation on the health issues. Dr. Sadra, coming to you. What are some of the key actions you think are needed for the government to prevent the greatest health harms of fossil fuel extraction? And along with that, I also want to ask you that how do you think a fossil fuel treaty would help accelerate this?
I believe your second question answers the first, that a fossil fuel treaty exactly solves all the problems we need to solve. And so I'm a huge admirer of this treaty, and will be working to enact it. Specifically because when I look at fossil fuels, they come in three flavors, right? Oil, coal, natural gas. I call them the unholy trinity. And of the three, natural gas wears the masquerade of clean energy because it's invisible. And yet, as we've seen through all these conversations, at the point of extraction, all the way until it's piped inside people's homes, it's killing people. And so it's not clean at all, because of all of the air pollution it creates simply to deliver it. And of the three forms of fossil fuel, because it's invisible, we bring it into homes for heat. We heat water, we have furnaces, and then most intimately, it's in our kitchens in the form of gas stoves. So we have continued at our research on fracking and the compendium to expand our analysis to not only look at the health harms of fracking itself for the communities and where the extraction happens, but all the way through the distribution process and inside our homes. So I would reference for you, I hope you have it in front of you, our handout on gas stoves, which is a summary of a whole chapter inside this giant compendium that I showed you. And it's just been translated into Spanish as well. And I should say our entire compendium is actually translated in Spanish. And for those of you who are watching remotely, the link is in the chat. And so what we determined through our research on gas stoves is that they are harmful and create air pollution even when they are turned off, right? So they're just leaking. And they're not only leaking methane, but also benzene and formaldehyde. And further, that having a fan blowing doesn't fully mitigate these problems. And we can see that children living in homes with gas stoves are at much greater risk for asthma. And in New York State, we're actually able to put a number on this. 18% of children with asthma in New York State got asthma because there's a gas stove in the kitchen. And so we are working in New York now with this data with urban planners and our elected officials on building codes. So we are trying to pass legislation so that any new building would not have a gas hookup, but rather would have heat pumps for heating and cooling and induction stoves for cooking. And that these things are run on electricity. They're also cheaper, and they will improve the health of people. So this is how the public health science can inform policy.
Thank you. Maito, coming back to you. Why the delivery of concrete plans to transition away from coal, gas, and oil within a clear timeline is a human rights issue, you think?
Thank you. I mean, I think I explained in the beginning why it is a human rights issue. And I think that being here at this conference it is really important because it also reminds us that it's, a global issue. Climate change is a global problem that requires a coordinated response from countries. And so cooperation between countries, cities, and regions is critical to reduce emissions and protect human rights. And as we've heard in the last few days, air pollution is transboundary, so it crosses national and jurisdictional boundaries, making collective action essential. So in a nutshell, I guess failing to transition away from fossil fuels in a timely way violates fundamental human rights such as the right to health, the right to life, and the right to a healthy environment.
Thank you. Madeline, before we close the session, just one last question from you. Can you speak about some of the health benefits of a just transition away from fossil fuels and a reduction in both production and mismanagement of plastics? And also I want to ask you that how can we communicate this critical evidence to key audiences from activists to policymakers better?
Thank you. I don't want to speak too long on the first part of the question because we are all aware of, and I appreciate all of us talking about the incredible health benefits of a just transition. I think we know what those are in many ways. I think that oftentimes the barrier happens to be communication, and how do we communicate these benefits to the audiences that we're actually trying to communicate? Who are we communicating to? And so, as you're sort of saying in the question, activists and policymakers, scientists alike, I want to, kind of be frank, which is that to say we are aware of the health harms of fracking, of air pollution, of microplastics, of plastics in general, but the folks who are not listening need to understand, the people that are making policy, that are aligned with all of our goals. We thank you, we salute you, and yet there are a lot of folks in positions of power who aren't listening because profits are just too high. And I would like to kind of bring us back to highlighting the fact that just like air pollution, just like you just said, Mirto, is transboundary, microplastics too. There's no specific sacrifice zone. They are in all of us. And understanding the fact that, front lines are always coming closer, they're always shifting, from a perspective of plastics is really important so that we can basically speak directly to policymakers and say, hey, from a fertility perspective, you're not spared. You can try, right? We can really try to reduce our exposure. And there are ways to reduce our exposure. But in many cases, it's a matter of how can we get folks to care when it's too easy for them to cast away marginalized communities as they have for so long. And to speak about the issue, I think we have to also understand the fact that as health professionals and folks immersed in the science, we are in a bubble and oftentimes kind of in our own silo. And just like Sandra and many of us here, the moment calls for us to become curious about how we can bridge silos and how we can reach audiences that we might not be able to reach. And I think one of those things is understanding that from a general public perspective, it can feel a little bit too overwhelming. In my work, I get a lot of sort of direct shutdown from folks who are privileged enough to not have to deal with the thought of, of increased health implications at all times. And oftentimes I get folks who are very dismissive because they do not feel that they have the power to take any kind of action. I would like to highlight an incredible paper by a mentor of mine, Executive Director of Five Gyres Institute, Microplastics Research and Education Organization, which is called Monitoring Compartments and Mitigating Sectors. And it's about how we can get specific. So monitoring areas where microplastics or plastics accumulate, just like with air pollution. Hey, we looked at the Great Lakes, we found a lot of synthetic cosmetic microbeads, and then tackling that particular issue. So understanding that there are a million ways to attack the problem and communicating about it from the lens of we can get specific, we have to get targeted, and also appealing the folks whose ears might turn off when we start talking about it. I think humor is actually a really important topic. It's a really important tool. I have seen in 10 years the rise of memes, like online memes about microplastics. And I, at first, kind of resisted thinking that, that it was a doomist kind of concept. I got really dragged on social media for that, and I quickly realized that we have to meet people where they're at, and that I have fully embraced microplastics memes, and I think that there's a huge communication kind of problem and barrier with what like the general consensus of folks who again are privileged enough not to think about these things all the time. kind of think, and as well as policymakers. And so I would encourage us to get curious about what really kind of is going to pique the interest of the folks that we're shouting to, who just aren't listening. A lot of them are, and we thank you, but for most of the people in power who are not listening, fertility data is critical. And I will end with this kind of soapbox, because I think it's important to just break through a little bit here, perhaps on a note that we can maybe chuckle at, but that is not funny, which is that thinking about fertility from the perspective of, okay, if we have data on fertility, that might get the folks who, again, are resisting thinking about this topic. If there are microplastics in your testicles, you might start to pass legislation that benefits everybody, especially the communities that are very, very highly and disproportionately impacted. It's sad. It's very, very sad that that is what I'm saying, that that's what it might take, but it's important to consider all of these angles. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry, a very quick last remark, because your point about not being listened to in these sort of policy-making spaces also reminded me that in some cases we really need to advocate for having a seat at the table. And by we, I mean international civil society, and I'm talking about international climate negotiations, the famous COPs, where in the last few years, there's been a lot of criticism around civil society participation, and by civil society here I mean both activists, human rights defenders, but also scientists, journalists, etc., any independent voice. And there have been various obstacles surrounding participation in these spaces for civil society and also frontline communities, I forgot to mention, because these spaces have become increasingly expensive. We've also seen that the number of fossil fuel lobbyists sometimes exceeds that of country delegations. And finally, in the last 3 years, COP has taken place in extremely repressive governments, specifically in the last couple of years, governments who are, two of the major global oil and gas producers. So in a nutshell, if the voices of those who are most affected by the climate crisis don't have a seat at the table, are not, free to participate meaningfully, there is a risk that their voices will be excluded from the negotiations, and in that sense, the policies that will be adopted risk not reflecting their realities, their lived experiences, and also what they have to contribute in terms of the solutions and the policies that we want to see in place. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the speakers, Sandra, Marto, Madeline, and Pavrin. We will be closing this session with that, and I want to call Lucas on the stage. Okay.
Thank you so much. If we can give him another round of applause. So we've made it through this week, 5 days of talks. Maybe you will still attend one in the afternoon if you're brave enough. What I can say from the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty perspective, just to kind of wrap up, is that, as many of us understand, the climate crisis is also a health crisis. And climate justice is an essential component of health equity. We believe that the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty offers a solution that can tackle the root cause of air pollution while fostering health equity. We are in a moment of profound crisis in multilateralism, in cooperation, in the advancement of our shared common objectives here. And this is why we need to come together and, as Madeline said, break silos, work together from a climate and health perspective across all levels of government, across sectors, to foster greater cooperation and address, again, the root cause of all this. We cannot continue in the way that we have been continuing. We need to support and complement the existing frameworks that we have and drive forward a real change that can be enabled by fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So thank you for joining us. We have the room still for a few more minutes. We have coffee. I've definitely had enough coffee for the week, but maybe you still have some capacity to ingest within healthy boundaries. And again, thank you for being here on this last morning. Thank you to the Global Climate and Health Alliance, and I'm really happy to be doing this together. Yeah, we'll see you again throughout the year, I'm sure, across both health and climate spaces that we are, as a treaty initiative, going to continue to work to bridge. Thank you.